Welcome everyone to today's webinar on safe and affordable alternatives to payday loans and bankability. The first thing that we'll start off with today is an acknowledgement. And my name is Jill Zacharias, and I'm the BC Manager of Growth and Impact, Communities Ending Poverty for the Tamarack Institute. I'd like to acknowledge and honor the 4 nations on whose traditional lands and unceded territories I'm calling in from, the Sinaiaks, the Tanaha, the Shakwapan, and the Silts people. And the first people who knew and stewarded this land from time immemorial were integral to the story of the inland temperate rainforest and surrounding mountain ranges. We acknowledge that we are meeting today on Indigenous land. As settlers, we recognize the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples and affirm our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. So, yes, welcome everybody. I'm really excited to introduce our wonderful lineup of speakers and panelists today. Murray Baker is the Manager of Financial Empowerment for the Family Services of Greater Vancouver. He is also a leading North American authority on student financial planning and the author of the bestseller, The Debt-Free Graduate: How to Survive College or University Without Going Broke. The book was number 3 on the Toronto Star bestseller list and is now in its 14th edition, which is totally amazing, with over 200,000 copies. He is passionate about financial education and empowering individuals to take greater control of their finances and become savvy consumers. He advocates for vulnerable populations, including promoting policy changes that facilitate the financial well-being of all people in Canada and developing programs that foster universal financial literacy. Erlene Woollard has worked and volunteered in both rural and urban settings over more than 5 decades. Erlene started her life's work in an orphanage for preschool children in Charleston, South Carolina, and went on to become a teacher librarian for the Edmonton Public School Board. She later was a substitute teacher and mentor tutor for students needing an alternative school environment in a small interior BC town for many years while her 3 sons were growing up. After moving to Vancouver in 1989, Erlene worked and volunteered for the Learning Disability Association of BC, the Vancouver chapter, in various capacities, and later became the founding executive director for the Self-Help Resource Association of BC, now PeerNet BC, which provides capacity building and support for people challenged by health and community needs. We're excited to welcome Adam. Adam Fair is the Vice President of Strategy and Impact at Prosper Canada. Adam began his career in social development at Prosper Canada in 2007. He is responsible for leading the strategic and operational planning and managing partnership development. Adam studied politics and economics at the University of Toronto. He also completed the graduate diploma in social innovation at the University of Waterloo in the performance measurement for effective management of nonprofit organizations at Harvard. Dr. Elliot Rossiter is a regular faculty member in the Department of Philosophy and Humanities at Douglas College in New Westminster, BC. His research, teaching, and community work focuses on different ethical and political dimensions of poverty reduction, including the relationship between the distributive justice and lending practices. And this is a really rounded out panel today. And I just would like to emphasize that the idea for this webinar came from our New Westminster partners who have been doing a lot of work on financial empowerment. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Murray and Erlene to kick off the panel.
Thank you very much for having me and the rest of our team together here. It's a pleasure to address this very timely and important topic. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about our experiences at Family Services working in the financial empowerment area and what we're seeing in terms of people impacted by these types of predatory lenders, and then look at ways we respond in terms of working with clients to help them dig themselves out, if you will, from the difficulties they've gotten into debt-wise with some of these lenders. So I want to talk about what works, what doesn't, and also what's next, some of the possible changes. So in terms of our work, we work with, just to give you some background, we work with clients doing financial empowerment education, but also one-to-one coaching. And it's in the one-to-one coaching where we see a lot of individuals who are really struggling with predatory lenders, payday loans, installment loans, etc. We take a trauma-informed approach. So we work with clients, non-judgmental. We don't care how they've got there. We're not there to judge them. We're there really to provide confidential support, advocacy, education, and really help them see some of the strategies. And we don't tell them do this or do that. We work with them so that they really are in control of the course they take in terms of overcoming the difficulties that they've had. So the challenges that we see with clients, and by and large, these are clients that have struggled. Perhaps they have poor credit ratings. Perhaps they're in a situation where they have had a time in their life where they struggled and maybe took on a bad credit rating because of that. They may be individuals that lack ID, so they don't have a bank account. They may be people that are unbanked. They may have gone through employment instability, which of course has impacted their credit rating, or they may have a lack of stable housing, or in some cases are even homeless. And oftentimes we find they really do not have a great understanding of the terms of the debt they carry, whether it's on credit card or whether it's through the payday loans. So the culmination of all these factors really lead to them having few affordable lending options. And let's face it, when we have people that are struggling and they need access to credit, it's not like they're sitting on a corner looking at one corner where there's a bank and one corner where there's a payday lenders and saying, I'm going to choose the payday lender. In their situation, when these factors are in play, it's a case of the bank, in effect, is closed to them in terms of accessing credit. They're not welcome for business. So they have to go to one of the other predatory lenders because of the factors which I've mentioned in this slide. So what we do is we look at the strategies, go through strategies, looking at the client's overall financial situation, looking at perhaps some of the trauma they've endured that have left them in a situation where they're struggling financially. We're identifying existing debt they have. In some cases, they may have credit card debt on top of payday loans. We look at, for example, whether they've tax filed. And it could be that they're in a situation where they're struggling financially, but perhaps they're missing out on some benefits that they would be able to access. And one of the tools we use is the newly created Wayfinder benefit navigation tool, which helps clients discover different benefits that they may have access to that may increase their financial viability and help them steer clear of these payday loan traps that they're getting into. We also look at exploring day-to-day support. So that could be anything from the rent bank. It could be looking at the food bank, if we're able to provide some grocery gift cards. But these are really kind of stopgap solutions, but still they may provide some relief in the interim until they can gradually get out of this debt. And then we work with them in terms of developing strategies for tackling outstanding debt. So looking at what are the high paying debt that they, high interest charging debt that they have, and how can we work with them to come up with a strategy to pay some of those higher ones down first, and come up with a plan on tackling the overall debt situation. And then we work with them. Out of this, we look at exploring more affordable credit options. And pardon? Oh, and unfortunately, exploring, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of affordable credit options out there. And that's really the difficulty, which I'll touch upon in a few minutes, is that there's not a lot of alternatives out there. So there are some, which I will mention in a case study that I'll get into. So in terms of the real life stories, I want to touch upon a couple of case studies. Erlene will touch upon her story, but first I'll give you an example of somebody who has, one of our clients who got in trouble with payday loans. And it was not the result of any sort of extravagant spending or frivolous spending. It was a case of they got into the situation because they were helping out a family member. So this individual was in their 70s, a senior retired pensioner on a fixed income. And they had multiple payday loans that they had taken on, as I mentioned, to help out a family member. And they were feeling extreme pressure from lenders and struggling to keep up. They were very conscientious. And it was a case where it was not only impacting them financially, but in terms of their mental health. And the comment that this individual made was whether they thought there was any point going on, which really underscores the impact it has on people's emotional and mental health and the danger it poses in terms of their own well-being. So what I did is worked with this client and got him to see that there were some options that we could look at. I was able to get him into the one of the alternatives, and that was the Vancity Fast and Fair loan. And so I was able to make an appointment. He went in and currently he was paying $1,100. Imagine that, a pensioner is paying $1,100 each month to keep up with these loans. And not a lot of it was going towards principal, a lot of it was just interest. So I was able to get him in to see somebody at Vancity the next day. He went in, saw them. Later the next day in the afternoon, he phoned me up the following day. He said, oh my goodness, he says, I finally had a good night's sleep. He said, they gave me a fast and fair loan. I'm now paying $350 a month instead of $1,100. I can make this work. And you know, that story sticks out in my mind in terms of how powerful. Now, this is one individual we see, but how many other individuals, and we do see many other individuals in similar situations, but how many out there that we don't see are going through the same type of situation. So as I mentioned, this is really underscores how imperative it is that some sort of action be taken so that people are not put in this situation. Now I want to turn it over to Erlene to talk about her lived experience and Erlene's story with one of her children in terms of their experience with payday loans. So Erlene, I'll turn it over to you. And do you need to share any slides, or are you okay?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me today. And thank you to Murray, because we are one of the families that he and his program helped out. So I'm here to tell you about my family's experience for our son Kevin's exploitation in the world of predatory lending. And I also want to ask your forgiveness because I'm going to have to read a lot of this because I found when I started telling the story, I would insert too many details and too many aspects of the story, and time would just go very, very fast. So I'm just going to read some of what I've written down to share today. So as you know, there are many different pathways into predatory lending. My purpose in being here and telling you how our family unwittingly were introduced to this culture is manyfold. There is some pain in this story, and I hope you'll get a picture of that. But I also want to you to see the concrete action that can and should be taken. Kevin has developmental disabilities coupled with emotional trauma. He came to live with our family when he was 5 years old, and the times for all of us after that were very tumultuous. However, we were a family with resources which we tapped into as best we could over the years. In school, he was bullied, had trouble making friends, and with the regular curriculum, but he always excelled in drama class. He learned self-advocacy skills, and as an adult, he always found employment that he could do with his limited abilities. He had a talent for finding adults in the work world that sympathized and tried to support him in these minimum wage jobs. But every now and then, he would have a meltdown and regress from the many stresses he felt just trying to keep up with life. He spent some time as a young adult exploring the dark side of life, where he would do things, he would turn his back on his family, he would make choices outside of his own best interest, and this caused many disasters to hit. So he would return full of remorse and determination. So fast forward to about 4 years ago, after many ups and downs, Kevin was now in his early 40s, and in his family's hopeful eyes, settled into a new studio suite near us and his new, cool, but still low-paying job in a craft brewery. He was exploring several activities with some success: bowling, wrestling, Special Olympics, and best of all, Real Wheels Theater Company, whose mandate is about full inclusion and integration of disability on and off Canadian stages, where his drama skills were supported and encouraged. He was still lonely though, as somehow none of these activities led to a special friend. Then he met the girl of his dreams through an online service after many tries. The next thing we knew, he had made her the center of his life and let the hobbies drop away. As things evolved, we had new worries, but Kevin was now a man in his 40s, had the love he had been yearning for, and his job. So we crossed our fingers and hoped for the best. After a while, though, we started to notice that Kevin was getting more and more agitated and anxious, as was his pattern under stress. He had a meltdown at work, which was a fireable offense, and he was given a chance to remedy the situation, but something was obviously terribly wrong. Then caring workmates informed us of their concern that he was being hounded by debt collectors. So next evening, he came for dinner and confided that he was deeply in debt. At first, we thought this would just be a small and manageable thing with which we could have the next lessons learned experience. However, we found to our horror that he owed over $38,000. How could this happen to someone making only $15,000 a year? It turns out that it all started because he wanted to buy his girlfriend a ring, to take in a movie, the occasional taxi on a rainy night, and to order in food. These are things that most of us might take for granted, but not someone like Kevin. He was given a phone by his girlfriend's brother, and ads started popping up about the ease and benefits of borrowing money. He got pulled in, and when we investigated, he was beholden to over 10 of the predatory lending companies, and at this point was trying to use one to pay off the other. In addition, he had assumed Vancity's Fair and Fast loan and had maxed out 2 credit cards. One of these cards he simply had signed up for at the P&E with no questions asked other than if he had an income. Another example of predatory financial behavior. In order to try to problem solve, he also used up a joint savings account at Van City, which he and I had together, which with Van City seemingly unable to require my signature because he was an employed adult. So this is a brief summary of a very long story, which time does not allow to tell in full, about how Kevin was pulled into this huge debt by predatory lenders, each of whom wanted to exploit him within the regulatory framework that currently exists and that we are trying to work together to change. So let's look at some important points that could lead to positive policy change. One, it's very expensive to be poor. The combined fees and interest rates work out to 130% or more annually. I certainly don't have to pay that much for a loan, and I guarantee none of you do either. Number two, the checks and balances that are purported to be in place don't work. While lenders are only allowed to lend half of a given paycheck, Kevin could and did go to 3 or 4 lenders, different lenders in a day, and find them all willing to loan to him, even though they could and did legally demand access to his bank account. Thus, all involved could see the impact of high interest, high debt, debit, and overdraft, and manipulated him into diving deeper and deeper into debt while ensuring that they were the first in line to be paid back. Number 3, these businesses are predatory and rapacious. When a person finally pays a loan off, they are congratulated and encouraged to take out that amount and more as a new loan. This gives a false sense of agency, a sense of agency so desperately desired by someone like Kevin and others on the margins of society. And it allows payday lenders to make huge profits on the backs of the financially and socially vulnerable. So within a few short months, Kevin, who at the start just wanted to feel like a grown-up, was in a spiral with debts over 1.5 times his annual wage. What kind of society insists that we make victims out of such caring and vulnerable people? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erlene. And I just want to emphasize that, this is not an isolated story. And I hadn't mentioned this to Erlene, that the following day after talking to her, we had a call from a caseworker with somebody with autism. A very similar story, had gotten into trouble with payday loans and had no real comprehension of the interest they were paying or the difficulty or the complexity of these types of loans. So thank you, Erlene, for sharing what unfortunately is a more common story than we like to think. Successes. I just want to touch briefly because I know we're limited in time. When we work with clients, we take a look at their overall financial situation and options. We look at debt sources and support clients in tackling these. We look at alternatives, and there are alternatives out there, but they tend to be very much stopgap. So for one of them, though, certainly, as I mentioned, is using the Wayfinder tool to look at government benefits, exploring the food bank, grocery gift cards, the rent bank, etc. And also looking for the more affordable lending options. And then as a last resort, in some cases, we do have to work with clients in terms of other options, in terms of a debt repayment plan. Now, we don't specifically do these plans. We help educate the client about how these plans work. And then we refer them to somebody such as the Credit Counseling Society, a nonprofit organization, to work with them if that's an option that they choose to explore. So finally, the proposed solutions, and this is a complex issue, obviously, but there are some real concrete methods that can be taken. One is capping of the exorbitant interest rates and fees charged by these businesses. Some of you may have read the Toronto Star article, which talked about how terrible this would be if they cap it, and that people would be forced in with worse lives because they can't access these loans, almost portraying themselves as providing a much needed service. The truth of the matter is, and we see a case like Erlene's, where it's not a case of denying them that these businesses will close down and people be worse off. The worst situation occurs when they get sucked into these type of predatory lenders and have to struggle even more to try and come up with the interest payments on top of what they originally borrowed. So that makes it very difficult, obviously, for people, and perhaps leads them into more desperate measures, mental health-wise, emotional, and in some cases even turning to measures such as criminal activity just to make to survive. Protection of vulnerable individuals when they are preyed upon, and recourse when this happened. Certainly, Erlene highlighted this. There is a need to protect those that need protection from the tactics and methods that many of these lenders use. A greater transparency and clarity of lending terms. Oftentimes, these are complex, written with great complexity, and made so that people don't understand what they're paying. And finally, the last one is the creation of affordable credit options for low-income and vulnerable individuals, government-backed, non-financial entity. And what I propose is the creation of a third arm's length lender, government lender that is supported by the banks. The banks are not interested in lending to these people. Their profits are very healthy, as anybody who's looked at bank stocks or looked at their quarterly reports. There's a need for them to contribute to some sort of separate entity which provides affordable credit to the vulnerable population within our society. So thank you for allowing me to speak, and also Erlene. If anybody wants to get in touch, I'm happy to provide more information, and they can reach me at the contact information there. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Murray and Erlene. That was really powerful, and it just, it's both heart-wrenching and frustrating, for those of us that are trying to affect change. Prosper Canada, our next speaker, Adam Fair, they've been doing a lot of work in this area. So Adam, I'll turn it over to you.
Did I get it right, or is it in presenter mode?
It's good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so great to be here. Happy to chat about this topic and be part of this conversation. Just for those who don't know, Prosper Canada is a national charity we've been around since 1986, and we're dedicated to expanding economic opportunity for Canadians living in poverty, both through programs and policy. And as Canada's national champion of financial empowerment, we're really trying to work with all sectors to figure out what might be holding Canadians back who are living on low income in terms of achieving their financial health, and how can we make sure that we're building the programs, products, services, and advancing the policies that can help individuals thrive. So really excited to be part of this conversation. In some ways, we've been chewing on or thinking about this challenge for a very long time, and so happy to share a little bit about what we've learned on this journey. My focus is going to be a little bit more on the basics of bankability, I guess you could say. What are some of the barriers that people are facing as it relates to just having a relationship with a basic financial institution, but I'll also bring in the kind of payday loan dimension of it as well. So in terms of barriers that we've identified both through experience and our research around basic banking, and some of these will echo what Murray has shared and others have experienced. ID can be a really big barrier for individuals. Just access to branches, I think, is something that is real for certain people in certain communities. Fees and unexpected fees, potentially holds on checks. An interesting one is just sort of fear of liens on your account. So if I use a financial service, they might actually garnish some of my wages because of other debts that I owe. Potentially low literacy, numeracy, or language skills, and just this sense of intimidation, fear, or actual stigma that people feel, and low confidence on financial matters. So there's a lot to unpack in these, but I'm happy in the chat to sort of talk through some of them in greater detail. In terms of like safe and affordable borrowing, and kind of again, building off what Murray was sharing, some people have just exhausted other credit. There's real difficulties finding safe small dollar loans. Individuals may not always understand the costs associated with some of the products that they're pursuing, and then people might not have collateral, like which could help people qualify for lower interest loans or safer loans. We've also done quite a bit of work with different groups across the country. As you know, everyone has some similarities, but there's also unique challenges for particular groups. And so we wanted to share some of the ones that we've learned about. So for newcomers, obviously language and literacy can be a barrier. Financial education more broadly can be an issue, because as a newcomer to Canada, you have to learn about how this complicated system works. High fees can be in play, and then as many know, even if you had a great credit score or history in your previous country, you come to Canada and it's kind of like carte blanche. It's like you didn't exist before, and you have to start from the ground floor, and this is really frustrating for a lot of people. For Indigenous peoples, all sorts of unique challenges. Again, lack of potential access to even the services in rural and remote regions can be a real challenge. Mistrust of non-Indigenous institutions, language barriers, financial information education gaps. And then also just some of the, the Indian Act and some policy actually might hinder people's ability to actually get more formal loans. I heard someone before tell me, who worked at RBC that worked in car loans, that if they have, that they kind of are discriminatory against giving car loans to people that they think live on reserve, because if the person is not able to pay their loans, they've got a more complicated situation in terms of getting that car back. And so I think there's these hidden practices that are happening, and even mainstream institutions around discriminatory practices for Indigenous individuals that I think we need to learn more about, dig into, and hope to rectify some of those practices. People with disabilities, unique challenges around mobility and accessibility challenges, assistance for those that have cognitive impairments, greater risk of fraud and abuse. And I think the story that was told today was really powerful, that speaks to some of these issues, and just some of the complexity of the products that exist, like the Registered Disability Savings Plan. There's just so much complexity in our financial services today. I like to say that nobody's good at this stuff, but some of us have help and some of us don't. So I think this is something we need to really kind of wrap our heads around. We did a project over 10 years ago, but it feels relevant to this conversation. So I just wanted to introduce it to you, and it might be relevant to the work that this group might be interested in doing in the future. We did a project called the Independent Living Account Project, and it was really working with a handful of homeless shelters and transitional houses in the city of Toronto. And it was a program that had these different sort of components to it. So one is an individual had to want to move out on their own. The next step was helping them create what we call a savings plan, or just even a broader plan of how they were going to move out on their own. The third step, which I'll dig into in a second, is actually helping them establish or reestablish a relationship with the financial institution. And in this case, it was a partnership with TD Bank, and really interesting learnings of overcoming some of the challenges in terms of helping to formalize that partnership. Provide a financial literacy course. It was a match savings program. So for every $1 they saved, they could get $3 in match. And then if they saved up to $400, that would create $1,200 that could then be used to develop a plan and pursue costs associated with moving out, first and last month's rent, utility hookup, moving expenses. So it was a really great program, but it was really interesting to dig deeper into this issue around bankability. And what we did when we were trying to figure out how to ensure that participants of this program could access bank accounts, one of the things we realized is that people were struggling with ID. And so we developed a part of the project in which someone would have one piece of ID and then they would have a letter saying they were part of this program, which would act as the second piece of ID. A lot of people don't know, but you can actually vouch for someone within a financial institution, and that can help overcome one of the ID pieces. So in this circumstance, we worked with TD to sort of make sure that they understood and were cool with the different features of this program. And so that was one that worked fairly well. In some cases, they waived fees. We learned that bank branches actually have a lot more jurisdiction in some circumstances than we understood. And so they can actually waive fees for an account, for example, for 6 months. And in some cases they did that. They helped to resolve past issues. So some people were like adverse to going to the bank because they knew that there was all sorts of challenges, or they may have tried something like defraud them in a past life and then they didn't want to re-engage. But we set up a context where people could come back, figure out what the situation is and try and move forward, and it worked pretty well. And then an important one is sort of a soft landing when people come to the institution. So there was someone who was assigned in each of the different branches that we worked with who were welcoming and were helpful for people to overcome some of those issues. So I won't go into all, you'll get these slides, all of the stuff on the right, but this is just from a report we did, which showed that generally it was a good experience. There were some cases where there were still some bumps along the road, but I think on all sides from both TD, the shelters and the individuals that went through the program, they felt that, you know, setting up this structured process worked really well to overcome some of these challenges that are faced with accessing banking services. So I'll leave you with this last slide, which is, you know, as we start thinking about potential solutions around bankability, you know, it's really, there's different ways you can tackle this work, and maybe this goes from more within our sphere to control to less as we go down, but that's a discussion we can have. But the first is, like we heard from Murray and others, is that community organizations and even family can be really helpful in navigating some of these issues. And so one-on-one financial help can really play an important role, financial coaching, problem solving, and there's a whole network of organizations that are doing this type of work that we collaborate with. And so if there's interest in pursuing those models, then we can talk about that. Like I was just sharing, partnering with financial institutions, I think that can happen at the branch level, but what we ended up doing is actually going to head office, and then head office brought together all of the branches that were in the communities we were working with and said, here's the deal. We're working on this project. We want you to accept this letter as a piece of ID. We want you to, where you can, waive fees. We want you to help people feel welcome in the institution. And that was surprisingly efficient in terms of that rolling out. You can look for community alternatives. There's some interesting work happening around saving circles and match savings programs, like I had shared. So trying to like say, okay, if the institutions aren't going to provide this solution, maybe there's ways that we can do it in community. Regulation, we think that the regulation is too low of a bar right now. Right now, it's really focused more on a basic bank account. But we think in this world, like you can't fly, you can't go anywhere without someone saying like, actually, we don't take cash, you need to have a credit card. So the bar is raised in terms of what people need access to. And I think there's a really strong case for regulation to catch up with that. And then influencing product design, and this is a tricky one, and Murray talked about Vancity's Fair and Fast Loan. I know about a handful of institutions that have tried to really crack this nut. It's a really tricky one, but I don't think it's worth ignoring. I think we have to keep kind of leaning into the space of how can we work with those institutions that want to help create safer and more affordable products. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was just fantastic, like a really good overview of the different kind of strategies that people can use at a community level to address this complex issue. To take us to the end of our conversation here, well, for one thing, first of all, I'd like to thank folks. There's people are putting resources in the chat. We've got some questions coming up, and I just wanted to know that let everyone know that if we do run out of time for a question and answer period, we will be sending out the slides, people's contact information after to participants after the webinar, so you can actually personally follow up and ask these questions. But to bring us to the bigger picture, I'll turn it over to Dr. Elliot Rossiter.
Hello, good morning, everyone. So it's a privilege to be here. So I've gotten involved in some of this work through my own involvement with New Westminster, our poverty reduction group, and then this particular working group looking at financial literacy and employment and income boosting and empowerment. So my research here comes from trying to support some of the work being done in that group, and then also a module that I work on that I've developed for use with my business ethics students. So that's kind of how I come at this, but I'm a philosopher and not a practitioner. So I'm going to be fairly general in some of the things that I'm going to say here. Although I did want to add, just as a kind of like first kind of remark, is that I really think that it's important to have stories in how we talk about these things. And so I particularly thought that it was great. Thank you, Erlene, for sharing that story. I think that there's lots of complexities around this issue, but I think that stories center us on the kind of more simple truth that really that what we're looking at with these issues are there are people in our economy who choose to make money from the suffering of other people in our economy, and that just needs to be stopped. And so I think that stories help us to kind of, focus us on that kind of basic kind of principle. But now with that being said, I have no stories to share, and I'm going to talk about some of those general complexities. So a little bit of kind of history about some of the political, economic, and social structures really that allow kind of payday lending to happen. I think one of the first kind of things that's important to recognize is just the nature of where money comes from in our economy, and how really most money in our system, in our money supply, is made through private banks, issuing loans. That's where the vast majority of our money supply comes. So our money supply is not some fixed thing as though it's like, set to a gold standard or anything. We're no longer on a gold standard. And so our money supply just kind of fluctuates basically, right? It's almost like an organism, really, I think is a more helpful way of understanding it. And so so money expands and contracts in the system, and private banks essentially create money through issuing loans. And then recently the central bank did something kind of comparable in terms of quantitative easing in the pandemic. But the ultimate effect of this really is to prioritize collateralized lending over uncollateralized lending, like payday loans. And so, I think when we're thinking about justice, it's important to think about not just kind of how money is allocated in our system, who gets money, who does not have money, but where is money expanded in our system? And it's really expanded to the advantage of those who possess assets. So those who already own stocks, those who own houses, those who own other assets, they are benefited through the very practice of how money is created within our system. And then who is harmed? Well, it's those who do not have assets, those who are taken advantage of, for instance, through the uncollateralized lending that happens in payday lending. And so, I mean, there's other examples of like where entrepreneurs, for instance, who don't have access to collateral have a much harder time, if not impossible time, trying to start a small business compared to someone who has access to collateral. So that's a basic kind of, I would say, injustice in our system. I think a second point here is that we have fewer institutions that involve sharing risk. So if we think about where risk exists in our economy, I think there's a great book. It's by the political scientist named Jacob Hacker called The Great Risk Shift. And the idea is about how in many different spheres of our economy, risk gets shifted from the collective to the individual. And you can see that in terms of something like the decline of unions, the decline of pensions, the decline of stable work environments in terms of people working now as independent contractors. You can see that in terms of housing. There's all different areas where risk in the economy gets sort of shifted from the collective to the individual. And that in many ways has been by design through certain kinds of wealthy interests, I would argue. But The third effect here is to third problem, sorry, that creates kind of the conditions for this is just the regulatory environment that exists. So in Canada, the kind of in the 80s, there was Bill C-44, and that was really a kind of neoliberal framework. And what I mean by that is really a laissez-faire approach. The idea that markets, unregulated markets, can solve problems. I disagree with that, but to explain why I disagree with that, I would far exceed my 10 minutes. But that I think is the basic kind of approach. And then I mean, we now have provinces doing involved in regulation, and that was the creation of the federal government in 2006. Essentially, shifted and allowed provinces to create regulation in this area. So let me switch my slide here. So what are some of the present challenges? So we've heard already. So I'm just going to go through this fairly quickly. But one of the big problems of individualizing risk, and then also I think where money is expanded and how that benefits people who have assets and that it expands assets, for instance, like housing. I don't think you can understand the expansion of housing prices without really understanding kind of how money is created in the economy. The ultimate effect of this is to really increase income volatility, which is month-to-month income fluctuations. We talk a lot about income inequality, and I think that's important, but I think where income inequality really, where the rubber meets the road is in terms of income volatility, where someone's low lows in their month-to-month income, when you're at your low, that's where really where kind of, you know, like someone can become unhoused, where there's kind of greater kinds of threats that people experience. And so I think income volatility is important to think about. I don't think we think about it enough. There's not very much research on this. I was reading a CPA Canada report that talks about how this is increasing, but I don't think we have enough research on income volatility in Canada and how people are vulnerable in the midst of that. And especially that's, I think, incredibly relevant for thinking about payday lending, obviously. And so then the deregulation in the midst of that volatility and vulnerability then increases predatory practices for people to take advantage of people in the midst of that volatility and vulnerability, which we've heard about. And I think I agree with the idea that we need regulation, but that there's, I think, ways in which we need to be careful about that. Sometimes that can shift the focus from brick and mortar to online activity, which is harder, for instance, for provinces to regulate. So I think that that's important, but needs to be done carefully. But even with regulation, it doesn't really solve that first problem of income volatility. So regulation can solve some of the predatory aspect, but I think that we need to really think about how to address the income volatility aspect is to think about the needs for alternate products, alternate and fair mechanisms for people to access small dollar credit. And I'm a philosopher, so I like defining my terms. When I think about fair access to credit, what that really means to me is that money ultimately is something that confers freedom upon us. And so for something to be fair, a fair lending practice is something that really enhances someone's freedom to live their life really as they choose. And so a predatory practice, so an unfair loan, is something that actually impairs someone's freedom in many different ways. Creates significant stresses, it creates significant mental health issues. And I think, you know, Erlene's story kind of illustrates a lot of kind of how these kinds of predatory practices really hinder and harm the freedom of others. So I think that we need to think about finance. I think socially beneficial finance is finance that really increases people's freedom within the economy, especially for low income borrowers. Okay, so I think future work that really needs to be done. I think both Adam and Murray have talked about this, and I agree with a lot with what they're saying. So there are some kind of alternatives that exist, but as we've heard, they're very kind of high barrier. There's a really interesting program actually in Australia I was reading about called, it's run by Good Shepherd. They have this, it's a good money stores program. But the access to that is fairly limited. It's a public kind of a nonprofit partnership. There was some pilot project done in the U.S. recently, in the 2000s, but that was it hasn't really had significant uptake in terms of that changing really traditional banking structure, and where alternative products exist, I think they are largely centered within credit unions. So in Canada, we have the Desjardins, there's the Mutual Assistance Fund, there is the Van City Fast and Fair Loan, and I was reading about one in Windsor recently, but the name escapes me. But most of the alternatives exist within credit unions. But then there are some barriers for people to access credit union spaces, and Murray talked about some of that. And so I think really what we need to do is to pilot more based on that problem, is to try to do more piloting of accessible, so low barrier kinds of access to loans, small dollar credit that are single stop. And what I mean by single stop is where people can get ID, for instance. You have an ID bank, you have other forms of support, so that you're trying to meet people really where they are at. And that ultimately are focused on promoting economic security. There are some initiatives to try to get the bank to do more small dollar credit, traditional banks. I think it's good to take a comprehensive approach, and I think wherever that we, that can happen, wherever you can find fairer terms, I think it's worth pursuing that. But I think really there needs to be that kind of alternative pilot kind of in terms of trying to get more kind of like partnerships, say, between credit unions, service providers, and other community organizations that provide these kind of single stop sort of places that are low barrier. And then lastly, I would say here, and I'll end, I think I'm at 10 minutes or very close to, if I'm not already over it, is I think the need really to recognize the systemic dimension of this, and that the use of payday loans is not in any way an individual moral failure. I think that is important to recognize that that's just really a lie, I would say. And instead, it's very much a systemic failure. If you think about the things that I've been talking about, if you think about how, one of the main kind of purposes that people use payday lending is, for instance, to cover rent in the midst of income volatility. And so that's the problem there is not really so much with the individual as it is with the fact that the rent is just too high, with the fact that, we have income volatility. And so I think that there needs to be, I think it's good to provide, to search for regulation, to search for alternative mechanisms, to provide counseling to people. But I think that there needs to be a broader it needs to be situated within a broader advocacy structure that recognizes that these problems are really part of a much bigger problem. And I'll end there, and if there's time, I'm happy to answer any questions. But thank you for hearing me out here.
That was just a fantastic overview, Elliot. I really appreciate that. And I just think that, when you talk about systemic failure, it shows it, brings to the fore once again how everything's interconnected, and that it's a systemic failure in more ways than one. I'd like to really thank everyone for putting resources in the chat. And I think we have time for kind of one question. And it seems to me that there has been a shift with certain banking institutions, and someone mentioned Canada Post and other institutions that are starting to develop alternative products. Is there just, I think the question was just like if there's more information about the alternative products that are being developed, and if that information is easy to access and being disseminated.
I haven't seen it all pulled together, but I think we're starting to in the chat in terms of some of these alternatives. I think one of the challenges that I've heard from institutions that have tried this is that the business model is tricky, and before they know it, they're like doing they're doing their, all the risk assessment and all this kind of stuff. And by the time they get through it, it doesn't look like a very good payday loan anymore. It looks like it's hard to see the difference between the other alternatives. And so I think the people that have been most thoughtful about it have realized that there might be some losses, or they might need to think about how to capitalize that work through other means, because it's a tricky business model. So anyways, but there are definitely quite a few organizations that I think are being listed on the right of people that are taking a good run at alternatives.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Adam. Well, we're coming to the end of our time here. Ruth, do you want to just share your screen again to the resources page? Perfect, thanks so much. And Jody, if you're with us today from Momentum, it's another organization that is doing a lot of financial literacy work. And Jody, did you want to speak to this slide?
Sure, beautiful. Thank you so much for inviting me, and what amazing information you shared. And you know, I should have thought to bring this as well, but Momentum has done a lot of work around high cost lenders as well. We partnered with community partners and local and provincial governments here in Alberta to ensure that many regulations were put into place around the lending, whether it be location or the fees that they can charge. And I don't even know why I didn't think to bring that with me if anybody was interested, but you can find it in our webpage. My main focus really that I wanted to share with you folks was our on-demand money management classes. So we all know that vulnerable folks oftentimes struggle with money management in general. And I think that's often what gets them into the trouble that they can get into with regards to these high cost lenders. And so we've created these asynchronous courses that folks can take at their own leisure. They are all free. All of our programming is free. They can come in and out of these courses as they see fit. They're about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the engagement that folks take for them. And they're really, like it says on the screen, the low barrier delivery, right? It just gives people the opportunity to engage where they're at, definitely. So please feel free. In fact, my challenge for each of you in the room is to take them. Take even one of them, just so that you can see how truly fantastic they are and how honestly they can change the lives of our folks that we are serving and trying to come alongside. Thank you again, Jill, for inviting me. This was such a pleasure and so amazing to listen to. And if anybody is interested at all, you can email me. I'll drop my email in the chat and I can get you more information about the work that Momentum has done around high cost lenders as well. So thank you so much for letting me come today.
Great, thank you so much, Jody. Really, really appreciate you sharing this information. And just one last thing is that we'd love to have all of you participate with us in a couple of weeks here at our Communities Ending Poverty member gathering. We're really excited about it. We're going to try and make it as inspirational and as useful as possible. And yeah, so don't forget to register. I'm sure you all have the registration link, and it is a member gathering. And if you'd like to learn about membership and you're not part of our Communities Ending Poverty network yet, please reach out to Natasha at the email on this slide. So once again, I'd like to thank everyone. We will be sharing this plethora of resources, the PowerPoint presentation and the recording for the call today in a follow-up email to everyone who participated. So thank you all for coming. Thank you. A huge thank you to our panelists, to Erlene, Murray, Adam, and Elliot, just for giving us such an in-depth, rich overview of this complex issue.